The mist in Martin County doesn't rise from the ground. It descends from the canopy, a heavy, suffocating blanket that turns the noon sun into a pale, watery ghost. On the morning of October 14, 1982, that mist was clinging to the bottom of Devil's Drop, a jagged ravine 3 miles off the nearest paved road, hiding a secret that would stain the reputation of the Kentucky wilderness for a generation. It was a Thursday, the air crisp with the smell of wet hickory and approaching winter. Park Ranger Jim Halloway was patrolling the perimeter of the state forest, looking for illegal logging operations, when he saw the birds. A murder of crows, black specks swirling in a chaotic funnel above the ravine, their calls echoing off the limestone walls like frantic laughter. Halloway parked his jeep and hiked down. He expected a deer carcass, maybe a black bear poached for its gallbladder. What he found was a scene that belonged in a Vietnam War dossier, not the peaceful hardwood forests of Appalachia. At the bottom of the ravine, impaled on a set of sharpened hickory stakes concealed beneath a layer of dead leaves, was the body of a man. He was hanging at an unnatural angle, the stakes driven through his thigh and abdomen, preserving him in a standing position of agony. He had been dead for at least 24 hours. But as Halloway scrambled backward, his boots sliding on the slick mud, he realized this wasn't an isolated accident. 20 yards away, suspended from a massive oak tree by a braided vine snare, was another figure. And further down the creek bed, face down in the water, lay a third. 3 men. No hiking gear, no hunting rifles, just shovels, backpacks, and the distinct muddy attire of root diggers. They hadn't just died. They had been hunted. They had been herded like cattle into a kill zone designed by someone who understood the geometry of the forest better than any engineer. When the Kentucky State Police arrived hours later, turning the silent woods into a cacophony of radios and shouting, they found no shell casings, no fingerprints, no tire tracks, just the primitive, brutal efficiency of nature turned into a weapon. 2 miles away, at the head of Blind Man's Hollow, 62-year-old Elias Thorne sat on the porch of a cabin that had never seen a power line. He was whittling a piece of white ash, the shavings curling around his boots like snow. He watched the police cruisers flash red and blue lights against the gray fog in the distance. He didn't run. He didn't hide. When Sheriff Bo Miller walked up the dirt path, sweat soaking his uniform despite the chill, Elias simply looked up and offered him a cup of sassafras tea. "They found them then," Elias said. His voice was like grinding stones, deep and devoid of tremors. "Elias," the sheriff said, his hand resting nervously on his holster, "there are 3 men dead in Devil's Drop. Rance Boyd is one of them. It looks like—" "God, Elias, it looks like a slaughterhouse down there." "Not a slaughterhouse, Bo," Elias corrected him gently, blowing the dust off his wood carving. "A garden. You have to weed the garden if you want the good things to grow." To understand why a local healer, a man who had delivered half the babies in the county and cured the other half of winter fevers, would orchestrate the most savage elimination in Martin County history, you have to understand the soil. You have to understand that in 1982 the mountains were starving. The coal boom that had fed the region for decades had collapsed, leaving behind rusted tipples, black lung, and unemployment checks that didn't cover the grocery bill. Martin County was desperate. The mines were sealed with concrete. The company stores were boarded up. Men who had defined their existence by their ability to tear energy from the earth were suddenly obsolete. In this vacuum of despair, the forest offered a lifeline that looked like a humble 5-leafed plant, hiding in the deepest, darkest shade of the north-facing slopes. Wild ginseng. Panax quinquefolius. To the uninitiated, it was a weed. To the buyers in Hong Kong and Seoul, it was immortality. An aphrodisiac. A cure-all worth its weight in gold, literally. In the fall of 1982, dried wild ginseng was trading for nearly $500 a pound. In an economy where a man was lucky to make $50 a week doing odd jobs, the forest floor was paved with lottery tickets. They called it green gold. And like the gold rush of 1849, it brought out the worst in men. It turned neighbors into rivals, friends into thieves, and the quiet sanctity of the woods into a battlefield. Elias Thorne was not a part of this fever. He was above it. Or perhaps he was beneath it, rooted deeper than the greed that swept through the hollows. He was a sang digger of the old school, a fourth-generation herbalist who treated the forest not as a resource to be stripped, but as a living cathedral to be served. He knew the plants by name. He knew that you never took a root unless it had 4 prongs, meaning it was at least 10 years old. He knew that you always replanted the red berries, the seeds, so that the next generation would survive. "You don't own the root," Elias would tell his sons Silas and Jude as they walked the ridges in silence. "You borrow it, and you pay interest with the seeds." Elias lived at the end of the world, in a hollow so deep the sun only touched the bottom for 4 hours a day. His cabin was a fortress of solitude, built from chestnut logs his grandfather had felled in 1910. He had no electricity, no telephone, no running water. He lived by the rhythms of the season. In the spring, he gathered morels. In the summer, he harvested golden seal and cohosh. In the fall, he hunted ginseng. Silas, his eldest at 35, was a giant of a man, mute since childhood after a fever took his voice. He communicated with his father through a series of hand signals and glances that were faster than speech. Jude, 32, was the sharpshooter, a man who could put a bullet through a squirrel's eye at 50 yards with a black powder rifle. They were extensions of Elias's will, limbs of the same ancient tree. But the Thorne family possessed something that made them the envy and the target of every desperate soul in Martin County. They were the guardians of the ancient patch. It was a legend in the local bars and pool halls. People whispered that Elias Thorne knew the location of a ginseng bed that had been untouched since the Great Depression. They said the roots there were as thick as a man's forearm, shaped like human bodies, wrinkled with 80 years of wisdom. A single root from that patch could be worth $1,000. The whole patch? It was enough to buy a way out of Appalachia forever, enough to buy a house in Lexington, a new truck, a life of ease. Elias never confirmed the rumors. He simply smiled his cryptic smile and sold his modest harvest of small roots to the local dealer, keeping the existence of the ancient patch a secret sealed in blood. It wasn't money to him. It was a trust, a sacred duty passed down from his father, who had told him on his deathbed, "This keeps us, as long as we keep it." But secrets in a starving town are hard to keep. Enter Rance Boyd. If Elias Thorne was the priest of the forest, Rance Boyd was the looter. At 45, Rance was a man whose ambition far exceeded his morality. He had been a shift foreman in the mines until they closed, a petty tyrant who enjoyed the power he held over other men's paychecks. When the mines shut down, Rance turned to sanging, not with reverence, but with industrial efficiency. He didn't walk the woods, he invaded them. He drove a lifted Ford Bronco that tore up the logging roads. He used maps stolen from the Forestry Service. He carried a police scanner and a heavy-gauge shotgun. And worst of all, he recruited. Rance gathered a crew of out-of-work miners, young men with debts and addictions, and organized them into a strip mining operation for roots. They didn't reseed. They didn't wait for maturity. They swept through a hillside like locusts, taking everything, seedlings, young plants, old roots, leaving nothing but overturned earth and extinction in their wake. Rance was Elias's second cousin, a connection that in the mountains usually afforded a degree of protection. But Rance had long since burned that bridge. He mocked Elias in town, calling him the witch doctor of Blind Man's Hollow. He told anyone who would listen that the old man was hoarding wealth while the rest of the county starved. "That old fool is sitting on a fortune," Rance told his crew at the rusted bar of the Black Gold Tavern on the night of October 10th. He thinks he's better than us. Thinks those roots are his children. Well, I say it's harvest time. The tension had been simmering for years, a slow boil of resentment and greed. But the escalation ladder began to climb on a Tuesday, October 12th, 1982. It was the day the pact between man and nature was broken. Elias Thorne had a routine. Every Tuesday in October, he and his sons would hike 10 miles to the county seat to trade herbs for supplies they couldn't make themselves: salt, coffee, ammunition, and fabric. It was the only time Blind Man's Hollow was left unguarded. Rance Boyd knew this schedule. He had been watching. At 9 a.m. on that Tuesday, while Elias was inspecting a bag of flour at the general store, Rance and 8 men parked their trucks at the base of the ridge. They didn't hike quietly. They moved with the arrogance of numbers, drinking beer, hacking at the underbrush with machetes. They had heard the whispers about the location of the ancient patch, high up on the north slope of Raven's Rock, hidden behind a thicket of rhododendrons so dense a bear would struggle to pass. It took them 3 hours to find it. But when they broke through the rhododendrons, even Rance Boyd stopped breathing for a moment. It was a cathedral. The sunlight filtered through the yellowing leaves of the hickory trees, dappling the forest floor in gold. And there, rising from the rich black humus, were hundreds of ginseng plants. They weren't the scraggly, 3-pronged stems common in the over-harvested woods. These were monsters. 5 prongs, knee-high, their berries a brilliant, shocking crimson. Some of these plants had been growing since William McKinley was president. "Jackpot," Rance whispered. Then he grinned, a jagged tear in his bearded face. "Dig it all, every damn bit of it." What followed was not a harvest, it was a rape. The men descended on the patch with spades and mattocks. They didn't carefully loosen the soil to extract the root hair intact. They hacked. They tore. They ripped the ancient roots from the earth that had held them for decades. But the true crime, the act that would seal their death warrants, wasn't the theft of the mature roots. It was the destruction of the future. In their frenzy, they trampled the seedlings. They crushed the red berries into the mud with their heavy boots. They uprooted the 1-year-old and 2-year-old plants that had no market value, simply because they were in the way. They didn't just steal the fruit. They burned the orchard. By Tuesday's p.m., the ancient patch was gone. A cratered, muddy scar lay where a century of growth had stood. Rance Boyd and his crew hiked out, their backpacks bulging with 50 pounds of green gold, a haul worth perhaps $25,000, a fortune, enough to drink for a year, enough to buy new trucks. They left behind empty beer cans, cigarette butts, and a forest that felt stunned into silence. Elias and his sons returned at dusk. The shadows were already stretching long across the hollow. As they climbed the ridge toward the patch to check on it before nightfall, as they always did, Elias stopped. He raised his hand, signaling Silas and Jude to freeze. He sniffed the air. Beneath the smell of pine and damp earth, there was something else. The sour, chemical reek of cheap tobacco. The faint, metallic tang of disturbed soil. Elias began to run. For a man of 62, he moved with terrifying speed, silent as smoke. When he burst through the rhododendrons and saw the devastation, he didn't scream. He didn't fall to his knees. He stopped dead, his body going rigid as a statue. Silas and Jude came up behind him. Silas let out a low, guttural moan, a sound of pure animal anguish. Jude gripped his rifle so hard the woodstock creaked. The sacred ground was churned mud. The berries, the children of the forest, were mashed into a red paste. The great-grandfather roots, the ones Elias had named, the ones he had spoken to for 40 years, were gone. Elias walked into the center of the destruction. He knelt down in the mud. He picked up a crushed seedling, its tiny white root snapped in half. He held it in his massive, calloused hand, trembling. "They didn't just take the gold," Elias whispered. His voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of a landslide. They killed the babies. They ended the line. He looked at the beer can lying next to his knee. Schlitz. Rance Boyd's brand. He looked at the boot prints. Deep, heavy lug soles, size 12. He knew those boots. Jude stepped forward, his face twisted in rage. I'll kill them, he hissed. I'll go to town right now. I know where Rance drinks. I'll burn the black gold to the ground with them inside. Elias stood up slowly. He brushed the dirt from his knees. The grief in his eyes had been replaced by something else. Something cold and ancient. Something that belonged to the Old Testament, to the time of plagues and floods. No, Elias said. You go to town, you go to jail. Rance has friends in the sheriff's office. They'll say it's just roots. They'll say it's trespassing, a misdemeanor. They'll fine him $50 and he'll laugh. He'll spend our inheritance on whiskey and whores, and he'll laugh. Then what? Silas signed furiously. We let them steal our soul? Elias looked up at the darkening sky. The wind was picking up, rattling the bare branches of the oaks. A storm was coming, a cold front from the north. The law of man doesn't apply here anymore, Elias said. They came into the wild. They broke the wild law. Now they have to answer to it. He turned to his sons. Go to the shed. Get the coil traps. Get the framing spikes. Get the bear grease. Dad? Jude asked, his voice uncertain for the first time. What are we doing? We are closing the forest, Elias said. Rance Boyd thinks he's a hunter. He thinks he took the prize. He doesn't know that the hunt hasn't started yet. That night, Blind Man's Hollow didn't sleep. Under the cover of a moonless sky, Elias, Silas, and Jude moved through the woods. They didn't go to town. They went to the choke points. They went to the game trails. They went to the ravines. They weren't digging for roots anymore. They were planting. They dug pits in the soft loam, lining the bottoms with sharpened ash stakes hardened over a fire, covering them with leaves so perfectly placed that not even a deer would notice. They set bear traps, massive, rusted iron jaws with teeth an inch long, and buried them in the mud of the creek crossings, boiling them in walnut hulls first to remove the scent of human oil. They rigged whippet traps, saplings bent back under extreme tension, armed with spikes, ready to swing out and impale a thigh or a chest with the force of a sledgehammer. They worked in silence, a grim assembly line of death. They were transforming 10 square miles of Martin County wilderness into a kill box. But Elias knew that traps alone weren't enough. He needed bait. He needed to bring Rance Boyd back. Greed was a hungry animal. You just had to feed it. On Wednesday morning, Elias walked into the general store in town. He looked defeated. He told the shopkeeper, loud enough for everyone to hear, that he was devastated by the theft, but that thank God the thieves had missed the lower patch in Devil's Drop, where the really old roots were hidden. He mentioned he was going to harvest it all on Friday before the snows came. It was a lie. There was no lower patch. Devil's Drop was a treacherous, rocky gorge where nothing grew but poison ivy and death. But Elias knew that word would travel. He knew Rance Boyd would be listening. He knew that a man who stole once would steal again, especially if he thought there was more to take. The trap was set. The forest was weaponized, and the escalating spiral of tragedy was about to spin out of control. Rance Boyd heard the rumor at noon on Wednesday. He was already drunk on the profits from the first haul, high on his own invincibility. "Did you hear?" he told his crew, his eyes gleaming with avarice. "The old fool has more. He's holding out on us." "Rance, maybe we should quit while we're ahead," one of the younger men, a kid named Toby, said nervously. "My grandma says the thorns are cursed. Says Elias talks to the devil." "Elias talks to plants," Rance spat. "He's a senile old man. We took his best crop, and he did nothing. We go back tomorrow. We clean him out, we take the Devil's Drop, and then we own this county." They made their plan. Thursday morning. 9 men. They would split up to cover more ground. They would bring guns this time, just in case the old man got brave. They laughed about it. They toasted to their cleverness. They had no idea that they were toasting to their own funerals. Thursday, October 14th, dawned cold and gray. The mist hung low. Rance Boyd and his crew of 8 drove their trucks to the logging road 3 miles from Devil's Drop. They hiked in, loud and confident. Elias was watching from the ridgeline, a shadow among shadows. He held his grandfather's black powder rifle, the heavy octagon barrel resting on a mossy log. He wasn't hunting for meat today. "Let them in," Elias whispered to Jude, who was crouched beside him. "Let them get deep. Once they cross the creek, there is no way out." Rance Boyd led the way, pushing through the laurel hells, his eyes scanning the ground for the telltale yellow leaves of ginseng. He reached the edge of Devil's Drop. He looked down into the ravine. It was steep, slick with moss. "Down there," Rance shouted to his men. "Spread out. Check every hollow." They descended. 9 men walked into the throat of the beast. The first scream happened at 10:14 a.m. It was Toby, the young one. He stepped on a patch of loose leaves near the creek bed. The ground gave way. He dropped 3 feet. The sound was a wet thud, followed by a shriek that tore the mist apart. A punji stake, carved from fire-hardened hickory, had driven through the sole of his boot and out the top of his foot. He was pinned to the earth. "Help!" Toby screamed. "My God, help me!" Rance turned, confused. "Toby?" He took a step toward the boy. Click. The sound of a tripwire snapping. From the underbrush to Rance's left, a sapling whip lashed out. It struck the man next to Rance, a burly miner named Carl, squarely in the chest. The spikes embedded in the wood shattered his ribs and punctured a lung. Carl went down without a sound, pink froth bubbling from his lips. Panic erupted. "It's a trap!" Rance screamed. "Get back! Get to the trucks!" They scrambled, turning to run back up the slope. But the slope was the kill zone. As they panicked, they lost their footing. They forgot to look at the ground. Another scream, the metallic clang of a bear trap snapping shut on an ankle, bone crunching. Then the first gunshot. It wasn't the sharp crack of a modern hunting rifle. It was the deep, booming roar of black powder. A cloud of white smoke erupted from the ridgeline 300 yards away. One of the men, scrambling up the rock face, spun around and fell backward. A .50 caliber lead ball lodged in his shoulder. "Sniper!" Rance yelled, diving behind a boulder. "Where are they? I can't see them." They couldn't see them because Elias and his sons were not wearing camouflage. They were wearing the forest. They had rubbed mud on their faces, woven ferns into their hats. They were part of the landscape. For the next 3 hours, Devil's Drop became a theater of horror. The men tried to flank, but every flank led to another trap. They tried to dig in, but the black powder rifles, with their slow, deliberate rate of fire, picked them apart. It wasn't a firefight. It was a culling. Rance Boyd, huddled behind his rock, listened as his friends died one by one. He heard them crying for their mothers. He heard them bargaining with God. He realized with a terrifying clarity that this wasn't about the ginseng anymore. This was an extermination. He looked at the mist swirling around him. He realized he was cold. Not just the weather. A deep, bone-chilling cold that started in his stomach. He was going to die here. For a root. For a plant. But Elias Thorne wasn't done. He didn't want Rance dead from a bullet. That was too quick. Too clean. Rance was the disease. The disease had to be purged. As silence finally fell over the ravine, the kind of silence that only comes when the screaming stops, Elias signaled to his sons. "Go down," Elias said. "Finish it." They moved down the slope with knives drawn. They checked the traps. They checked the wounded. They didn't offer aid. They offered release. When they found Rance, he was the last one left alive. He had fired all his shotgun shells at the trees, at the shadows, at nothing. He was shivering, his eyes wide and vacant. He saw Elias emerge from the mist like a wraith. The old man looked 10 feet tall. "Elias," Rance croaked. We were just digging." "You were stealing," Elias said softly. "You stole the future." They didn't shoot Rance. They dragged him. They dragged him to the center of the ravine, to the base of the massive oak tree where the false rumor said the treasure was hidden. Elias pulled a handful of red ginseng berries from his pocket, the seeds he had salvaged from the destroyed ancient patch. "You wanted the root," Elias said, looking down at the man who had been his blood. "Now you are the soil." He forced the berries into Rance's mouth. Then they hoisted him up. The snare tightened. The steel cuffs clicking around Elias Thorne's wrists didn't sound like an arrest. They sounded like the closing of a book. On that porch, surrounded by the deepening twilight of Martin County, the 62-year-old herbalist didn't look like a man who had just orchestrated the massacre of 9 people. He looked like a grandfather finished with his chores. He allowed Sheriff Bo Miller to guide him down the wooden steps, past the piles of split firewood, past the drying racks where goldenrod and echinacea hung in bundles, and into the back of the patrol car. He moved with a slow, arthritic grace, careful not to bump his head on the doorframe, showing more concern for the sheriff's upholstery than for his own looming execution. Silas and Jude followed. Silas, the mute giant, walked with his head down, his hands bound behind his back with plastic zip ties because the sheriff had run out of metal cuffs. He didn't struggle. He didn't make a sound. He simply watched his father's silhouette in the car ahead of him, his eyes dark and unreadable pools of loyalty. Jude, the sharpshooter, looked once at the tree line, a longing glance toward the freedom of the deep woods, before surrendering his rifle to Deputy Haskins. The weapon, a Hawken .50 caliber muzzle-loader, was still warm. It smelled of sulfur and death. As the convoy wound its way down the rutted track from Blind Man's Hollow, leaving the silence of the high ridges for the chaos of the world below, the radio in Sheriff Miller's car crackled to life. It was the state police recovery team at Devil's Drop. Their voices were pitched high, tight with a panic that professionals rarely show. "Sheriff, you need to tell us where the rest of them are," the voice on the radio stuttered. "We almost lost Officer Bradley. God Almighty, there's tripwires everywhere. The ground is rigged. We can't move the bodies without risking the living." Elias, sitting in the back seat, leaned forward slightly. "Tell them to watch the rhododendrons," he said softly, his voice calm over the hum of the engine. "The roots are slippery. And tell them not to touch the yellow leaves. The yellow leaves hide the teeth." Sheriff Miller stared at him in the rearview mirror, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "You booby-trapped the recovery site, Elias. You set traps for the cops." "I set traps for the intruders," Elias replied, leaning back against the vinyl seat. "I didn't know who would come to pick up the trash. The trap doesn't distinguish between a thief and a coroner, Bo. It only knows weight. It only knows pressure." That night, the Martin County Jail, a small 4-cell block in the basement of the courthouse, became the center of a national storm. But before the satellite trucks arrived, before the lawyers descended, there was the processing, the indignity of the booking room. Elias stood patiently while they took his fingerprints, his calloused thumbs pressing ink onto the card, leaving whorls that looked like the rings of an ancient oak. When they asked him to strip for the orange jumpsuit, they saw his body. It was a map of the mountains, scars from briars, burns from black powder, muscles roped and lean from 6 decades of climbing slopes that would break a mule. He didn't look frail. He looked like he was carved from the same hickory he used to kill. The interrogation began at 11 p.m. It wasn't handled by Sheriff Miller alone. The Kentucky Bureau of Investigation had sent Detective Eris Thorne, no relation, a coincidence that seemed to annoy the city cop, to take lead. Eris was a man of suits and cigarettes, a creature of fluorescent lights who looked at Elias with undisguised disgust. "We have 9 bodies, Mr. Thorne. Aris said, slamming a file onto the metal table. 9. We have men impaled. We have men shot. We have Rance Boyd strangled with a vine. This isn't self-defense. This is recreational slaughter. Why did you do it? For a plant? For some roots? Elias sat perfectly still. He hadn't touched the water they gave him. You call it a root, Elias said, because you buy it in a bottle at the pharmacy. You don't know it. You haven't listened to it grow for 80 years. It's a plant, Elias, Aris shouted. It's ginseng. It's $500 a pound, sure, but it's vegetation. You traded 9 human souls for vegetation. They didn't just take the root, Elias said, his voice dropping an octave, forcing the detective to lean in. They took the seed. When you take the root, you take the present. When you destroy the seed, you kill the future. Rance Boyd went into a cathedral and smashed the stained glass. He burned the pews. He didn't leave enough for the forest to heal. If a man burns down your house, detective, do you arrest the fire or do you arrest the man? You're the fire in this metaphor, Elias, Aris sneered. No, Elias corrected him. I am the rain that puts the fire out. Sometimes the rain is a flood, and the flood drowns the rats. While Elias spoke in riddles that frustrated the state investigators, the recovery effort at Devil's Drop was turning into a nightmare. It took 3 days to clear the ravine, 3 days of bomb squad technicians sweeping the forest floor with metal detectors inch by inch. Every step was a gamble. The yellow leaves Elias had mentioned covered bear traps that had been modified with serrated edges, designed not to hold a leg, but to sever it. The coroner, Dr. Silas Vance, a distant cousin of the Moonshine Vances, suggesting violence ran in the county's water, described the scene in his report as industrialized primitive warfare. The body of Toby, the young boy impaled on the punji stakes, required a chainsaw to extract. The wood had fused with the bone. The sheer mechanics of the death, the tension of the sapling whip that killed Carl, the torque required to snap a human neck, spoke of a physical strength and an engineering prowess that terrified the locals. This wasn't just murder. It was craftsmanship. When the bodies were finally brought up, laid out in a row under white tarps in the high school gymnasium because the morgue was full, the town of Inez broke. The grief was immediate and loud. These weren't strangers. These were sons, brothers, fathers. Rance Boyd might have been a thief and a bully, but he was also a fixture at the Friday night football games. The young men who died with him were just boys looking for a payday in a county that offered none. The community fractured. On Sunday morning, the sermons were split. At the First Baptist Church, the preacher railed against the Cain-like wrath of Elias Thorne, calling him a demon who had hidden among them in the guise of a healer. He healed the body but poisoned the soul, the preacher thundered. He worshipped the creation more than the Creator. But in the smaller Hollerside churches, the Free Will Baptists and the Snake Handlers, the message was different. There the text was taken from the Old Testament. Remove not the ancient landmark which thy fathers have set. They spoke of Elias as a man who had been pushed too far. They whispered about the disrespect of the younger generation, about the drugs Rance Boyd had brought into the county, about the way the woods were being raped by machinery. Elias didn't kill innocent men, a coal miner named Dully whispered to his wife over Sunday dinner. He killed locusts. You don't cry for the locust. The legal system, however, does not recognize the metaphor of the locust. The grand jury convened in November. It was a formality. The evidence was absolute. Elias had confessed. Jude had led them to the hidden cache of gunpowder. Silas had drawn a map of where the remaining traps were buried, saving a deputy's leg in the process. They were indicted on 9 counts of capital murder, 9 counts of kidnapping, and domestic terrorism. The prosecutor, a shark from Lexington named Hamilton Bell, announced he would seek the death penalty for all 3. We will hang them, Bell told the press on the courthouse steps. We will hang them high to show the world that Kentucky is not a savage land where witches rule the woods. But preparing the defense was a nightmare. Their court-appointed attorney, a weary public defender named Sarah Jenkins, realized quickly that she couldn't use insanity. Elias was the sanest man she had ever met. He was lucid, intelligent, and terrifyingly logical. He didn't think he was Napoleon. He thought he was the landlord evicting bad tenants. "Elias," Sarah said during a jailhouse visit, the winter wind howling outside the thick stone walls, "we have to give the jury something. We have to say you were afraid, that they threatened you." "They did threaten me," Elias said calmly. "They threatened my existence." "No, Elias. They threatened your income. That's different." Elias looked at her with pity. "Income is what you get from a job you hate, Sarah. This was my life. If I let them take the ancient patch, if I let them strip the mother roots, then I am just an old man in a cabin waiting to die. By stopping them, I remained Elias Thorne. I preserved the order of things." "The jury won't understand order," Sarah argued, slamming her hand on the table. "They will understand fear. Tell them Rance had a gun. Tell them he shot first." "I will not lie," Elias said. "Rance fired his gun at the trees. He was afraid. I was not. To lie would be to disrespect the dead. I killed them. I own that. I will not cheapen it with a lie." The trial began in January 1983. It was the coldest winter on record. The roads to the courthouse were lined with ice, but the courtroom was packed every single day. The heat from the bodies fogged the windows. People stood in the aisles. They came to see the root killer. They came to see the monster. Hamilton Bell, the prosecutor, laid out his case with surgical precision. He displayed the weapons, the black powder rifles, the bear traps still stained with dried blood. He showed the jury the boots of Rance Boyd, the leather torn by the snare. He painted a picture of Rance and his men as hapless adventurers, perhaps a bit greedy but ultimately harmless, lured into a house of horrors by a sadistic old man. "They went looking for a root to feed their families," Bell shouted, pointing at the defense table. "And they found a war zone. This man," he pointed at Elias, "sat on a ridge and picked them off like tin cans on a fence post. He watched them suffer. He watched them bleed. And then he ate his dinner." When it was time for the defense, Sarah Jenkins did the best she could. She called character witnesses, women whose babies Elias had saved from croup, men whose broken legs he had set when they couldn't afford a doctor. She tried to paint him as a pillar of the community who had snapped under the pressure of the economic depression. But the testimony that silenced the room didn't come from a character witness. It came from the sheriff. Bo Miller took the stand, looking uncomfortable in his dress uniform. He loved Elias. He had arrested him, but he loved him. "Sheriff," Sarah asked, "how would you describe the ancient patch, the place Rance Boyd destroyed?" "It was," Bo paused, searching for words. "It was special. I'd never seen ginseng like that. It looked like a garden. You could tell someone had been tending it for a long time, maybe 100 years. And when you saw it after Rance Boyd had been there," Bo looked down at his hands, "it looked like a bomb went off. They didn't just dig it, they tore it up. It was hateful. It looked like they did it out of spite." "Did Elias ever speak of money?" "No," Bo said softly. "Never. He lived on nothing. He gave most of his medicine away for free." "So why do you think he did it, Sheriff?" "Objection," Bell shouted. "Calls for speculation." "Overruled," the judge said, leaning forward. "I want to hear this." Bo looked at Elias. Elias nodded, giving him permission. "I think," Bo said, his voice trembling, "I think Elias believes that God put him there to watch the gate. And when Rance kicked the gate down, Elias realized the only way to fix it was to close it forever." The climax of the trial came not with a bang, but with a visual. The prosecution introduced Exhibit 44. It was the jar of ginseng berries Elias had tried to force into Rance Boyd's mouth. Bell held the jar up to the light. The tiny red seeds rattled against the glass. This, Bell said, his voice dripping with theatrical disdain. This is what 9 men died for. Seeds. Bird food. Elias stood up. He wasn't supposed to. His lawyer grabbed his arm, but he shook her off. The bailiffs moved forward, hands on their tasers, but the judge held up a hand. "Sit down, Mr. Thorne," the judge ordered. "That is not bird food," Elias said, his voice filling the room without shouting. "That is 500 years of life. You hold it in your hand and you mock it. That is why Rance Boyd is dead. Because he mocked the life that sustains him. Mr. Thorne, sit down or you will be held in contempt." "I am already in contempt, Your Honor," Elias said, remaining standing, looking like an Old Testament prophet in a prison jumpsuit. "I am in contempt of a world that thinks it can eat everything and never get full. I am in contempt of men who think the earth is just a warehouse to be looted. You can kill me, you can hang me, but you cannot make those seeds grow. Only I could do that, and you are about to kill the gardener." The jury went out on a Friday afternoon. The snow was falling heavily now, blanketing the town in white, covering the scars of the mining roads, covering the blood in Devil's Drop. The town waited. The state waited. While the jury deliberated, locked away in a room that smelled of stale coffee and responsibility, Elias sat in his holding cell. Silas and Jude were in the cells next to him. They couldn't see each other, but they could hear. "Jude," Elias whispered through the bars. "Yeah, Dad." "Do you regret it?" There was a long silence. Jude was young. He had a life ahead of him. He had a girl in Inez he had been courting. "I regret that they came," Jude said finally. "I regret that they forced us, but when I close my eyes, Dad, I see the patch. I see it the way it was before, and I know we didn't let it die without a fight." "Good," Elias said. "That is enough." The verdict came back in 4 hours. It was fast. Too fast for an acquittal. Too fast for a compromise. Guilty. On all counts. The foreman, a school teacher named Mrs. Gable, couldn't look Elias in the eye when she read it. Her hands shook. "We find the defendant, Elias Thorne, guilty of 9 counts of murder in the first degree." The courtroom erupted, half in cheers, half in wailing. Rance Boyd's widow, sitting in the front row, sobbed into her hands. But Elias didn't flinch. He stood tall. He looked at his sons. Silas made a sign with his hand, a fist over his heart. Strength. The sentencing phase was scheduled for the following Monday. But the story of the Appalachian Purge was not going to end in a sterile execution chamber years down the road. The forest had one last card to play. The Irony Bank was about to make a withdrawal. That weekend, a massive ice storm hit Martin County. Power lines snapped like twigs. The roads became impassable. The jail lost electricity. The backup generator failed. The temperature in the cells dropped to freezing. Sheriff Miller sat in the dark with his prisoners, wrapped in blankets, drinking whiskey to stay warm. It was an intimate, bizarre scene. The captor and the captives huddling against the wrath of the very nature Elias claimed to serve. "You see, Bo," Elias said, his breath pluming in the icy air. "The winter doesn't care about your verdict. The winter comes for the judge and the convict alike." "Shut up, Elias," Bo said, but there was no heat in it. "Just drink your whiskey." "I have one request, Bo," Elias said. "When they take me to Eddyville, don't let them take my boys in the same van. Silas gets carsick. He needs a window." "I'll see to it," Bo promised. "And one more thing." Elias reached into his pocket. He pulled out a single dried object. It looked like a shriveled finger. It was a root. A small, perfect, man-shaped ginseng root. He had hidden it in his boot since the arrest. "Give this to Sarah Boyd," Elias said. "What?" Bo stared at him. "You want to give a gift to the woman whose husband you strangled?" "It's for the boy," Elias said. "Rance's son. He has a cough. I heard it in the courtroom, a deep chest cough. This will cure it." Boil it in water with honey. Elias, you're insane. Perhaps, Elias smiled in the darkness. But the boy is innocent. The root heals the innocent. It kills the greedy. Let the boy live. Maybe he will be better than his father. Bo took the root. It felt warm in his hand. Monday came. The ice melted enough for the convoy to move. The judge sentenced Elias, Silas, and Jude to death by electrocution. The date was set. The appeals would be filed, but everyone knew the outcome. They were loaded into the vans. Elias looked back at the mountains one last time. They were white and silent, majestic and indifferent. As the heavy steel doors of the Kentucky State Penitentiary in Eddyville slammed shut on Elias Thorne in the spring of 1983, but the root killer didn't just disappear into the system. He haunted it. The castle on the Cumberland, a Gothic stone fortress that looks more like a medieval dungeon than a modern prison, became the final garden for the man who had closed the forest. For the first 6 months, Elias was kept in administrative segregation. The warden, a pragmatic man named Clark, was terrified that the general population, violent men, thieves, gang members, would try to make a name for themselves by taking out the famous ginseng butcher. But Clark soon realized his mistake. The other inmates weren't hunting Elias Thorne. They were terrified of him. Rumors spread through the cell blocks like a virus. They whispered that the old man could hex you with a glance. They said he knew recipes for poisons that could stop your heart without leaving a trace in an autopsy, concocted from cafeteria food and dust. When Elias was finally moved to death row, the Green Mile of Kentucky, a strange silence fell over the tier. Elias didn't pace his cell. He didn't scream at the guards or file endless, frantic appeals like the other condemned men. He sat on his bunk, perfectly still, his eyes closed, breathing in a rhythm that matched the wind he could no longer feel. He told the chaplain, a young man named Father O'Malley who tried to save his soul, that he wasn't praying. He was walking. In his mind, he was hiking the ridgeline of Blind Man's Hollow, checking the saplings, counting the rings on the stumps, watching the seasons turn. He lived inside a memory so detailed it was more real to him than the concrete walls. But while Elias thrived in the soil of his own mind, his sons withered in the sterility of the cage. Silas, the mute giant, disintegrated first. Without the physical labor of the woods, without the constant sensory input of the forest, the smell of rain, the texture of bark, the sound of prey, his mind began to turn inward. He couldn't speak to the therapists. He couldn't communicate with the guards. He became a ghost in his own body. In 1985, 2 years into his sentence, Silas stopped eating. It wasn't a hunger strike, it was a biological shutdown. He simply lost the will to consume fuel for a life he no longer recognized. They force-fed him. They moved him to the medical wing. But you cannot keep a tree alive if the roots are severed. Silas Thorne died on a Tuesday in November 1985 of heart failure brought on by extreme malnutrition and stress. He was 38 years old. When the news reached Elias's cell, the old man didn't weep. He asked for a piece of paper and a pencil. He drew a single, perfect oak leaf, tore it out, and placed it under his pillow. "One branch falls," Elias whispered to the empty air. "The tree stands." Jude lasted longer, but his end was more violent. The sharpshooter, the man of action, burned with a rage that the prison couldn't contain. He got into fights. He attacked a guard who mocked his father. He spent months in the hole, the solitary confinement unit where the darkness is absolute. In 1987, during a riot in the exercise yard, Jude was stabbed 17 times by a rival faction from Louisville. He died on the concrete, bleeding out under a basketball hoop that had no net. His last words, gurgled through a punctured lung, were not for his father or his God. He whispered, "Check the traps." Elias was now the last Thorne. The lineage he had killed 9 men to protect was dead. The seed he had spoken of so passionately in the courtroom had been crushed not by Rance Boyd, but by the consequences of Elias's own vengeance. The irony was total. He had saved the ancient patch from strangers only to ensure that no Thorne would ever harvest it again. But Elias refused to break. He refused to give the state the satisfaction of seeing him mourn. He became even more stoic, more detached. He began to receive letters, not hate mail, though there was plenty of that, but letters from desperate people, mothers in Appalachia whose children were sick, old men whose joints burned with arthritis. They wrote to the witch doctor of death row, begging for remedies, for secrets, for hope. And Elias answered them. Using the limited stationery allowed to inmates, he wrote back. He didn't offer magic. He offered botany. Boil willow bark for the pain. Use slippery elm for the throat. Find the yellow root by the creek for the stomach. He became a jailhouse apothecary, dispensing cures from a cage designed for execution. It was his final act of defiance. The state had labeled him a killer. He insisted on remaining a healer. The end came in 1989. The appeals had run dry. The governor, facing a tough re-election campaign and needing to look tough on crime, signed the death warrant. Elias Thorne was scheduled to die in the electric chair on October 14th, exactly 7 years to the day after the bodies were found in Devil's Drop. The symmetry was not accidental. The state loves a good narrative. On his final day, Elias refused the traditional last meal. He didn't want steak or fried chicken. He asked for a glass of water and a raw potato. The warden granted the request, baffled. Elias ate the potato slowly, savoring the taste of the earth, the starch, the raw life of it. Sheriff Bo Miller came to see him. Bo had retired 2 years earlier, the stress of the case having given him an ulcer that felt like swallowing hot coals. He looked old, tired, a man consumed by the ghosts of his own jurisdiction. "Elias," Bo said, sitting on the other side of the plexiglass. "It didn't have to be this way." "It had to be exactly this way, Bo," Elias replied, his voice strong, his eyes clear. "The debt is paid. The forest is safe." "Safe?" Bo laughed, a bitter, hacking sound. "Elias, nobody goes into Blind Man's Hollow anymore. They say it's haunted. The timber companies won't touch it. The hunters stay away. It's a dead zone." "Not dead," Elias smiled. "Fallow. It's resting. I bought it time. That's all any of us can do." "And the boy?" Bo asked. "Sarah Boyd's kid. You remember? You gave me the root." Elias leaned forward. "Did she use it?" "She did," Bo said. "She was desperate. The doctor said it was pneumonia, said he wouldn't make the winter. She boiled that root, made him drink the tea. He recovered in 3 days. The doctors called it a miracle." Elias nodded, satisfied. "It wasn't a miracle. It was Panax. Life for life. I took rants, I gave back the sun. The balance is kept." That night, they shaved Elias's head. They shaved his leg for the electrode. He walked to the chair without assistance. He didn't look at the witnesses. He didn't look at the executioner. He closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, and for a moment the sterile smell of antiseptic and ozone faded, replaced by the scent of damp leaves, decaying hickory nuts, and the rich, musk-heavy odor of wet earth. When they asked for his final words, Elias Thorne didn't ask for forgiveness. He said 3 words, spoken to a room that would never truly understand them. "Watch the seeds." The surge of electricity ended the life of the Martin County herbalist at 11:04 p.m. But it didn't end the story. Sarah Boyd, the widow of the man who started the war, never remarried. She raised her son, Timothy, the boy saved by the root, in a small house in Inez. She never told him where the medicine came from. She wanted him to grow up without the shadow of the feud. But blood has a way of remembering. Timothy grew up strong. He didn't become a miner. He didn't become a poacher. He became a botanist. He studied forestry at the University of Kentucky. He spent his life studying the reclamation of strip-mined land, trying to heal the scars left by the industry that had killed his father's generation. He felt a pull to the woods he couldn't explain, a deep, resonant vibration whenever he stepped under the canopy of an old-growth forest. In 2005, 23 years after the massacre, Timothy Boyd, now a professor, led a research team into Martin County to survey the biodiversity of the neglected hollows. He didn't know the specific history of Blind Man's Hollow. His mother had kept the location vague, a forbidden zone in the family geography. But the maps led him there. The team hiked into the area locals still called the Devil's Garden. It was overgrown, wild, primal. The trails Elias had walked were gone, swallowed by briars and kudzu. The cabin had collapsed, reduced to a pile of rotting chestnut logs covered in moss. But when they reached the north slope of Raven's Rock, the site of the ancient patch, Timothy stopped. The forest here was different. The undergrowth was thin, the canopy was majestic, and covering the ground, stretching for acres, was a sea of green five-leafed plants, ginseng, thousands of them. The patch hadn't just survived, it had exploded. Without humans to harvest it, without poachers to trample it, the seeds Elias had fought to protect, the seeds Rance Boyd had tried to steal, had germinated. They had spread. The destruction of 1982 had inadvertently aerated the soil, and the lack of human intrusion for 2 decades had created a sanctuary. Timothy stood in the middle of a fortune worth millions of dollars. He knelt down. He dug up a single root. It was massive, ancient, shaped like a man twisting in pain or dancing in joy. He held it in his hand, feeling the strange, electric connection to the earth. He didn't know that his father had died 50 yards from this spot. He didn't know that the man who saved his life had been executed for protecting this very dirt. He just knew that this place felt sacred. He turned to his grad students who were staring wide-eyed at the green gold. "What do we do, Professor?" one of them asked. "Do we document it? Do we publish the coordinates? This is the find of the century." Timothy looked at the root. He looked at the deep, silent woods. He felt a phantom cough in his chest, a memory of a sickness he barely recalled, and the taste of bitter tea on his tongue. "No," Timothy said. He placed the root back in the hole. He covered it with dirt. He patted the leaves back into place. "We don't map this. We don't tell anyone." "But why?" "Because," Timothy said, looking into the shadows where the ghosts of 9 men still lingered, "some things don't belong to us. Some things just want to be left alone." He led his team out of the hollow. He marked the area on the official survey map as unstable terrain, high risk of rockslide. He effectively quarantined the ancient patch for another generation. The irony was complete. Rance Boyd's son had become the guardian Elias Thorne always wanted. The blood debt had been paid, and the forest had engineered its own protector. Today, Martin County is quiet. The coal is gone. The opioids have come and gone and come again. The people struggle as they always have. But up in Blind Man's Hollow, the wind still moves through the hickory trees. The bear traps have rusted into orange dust, returning their iron to the soil. The bones of the dead have long since been buried. But if you go there in October, when the mist is thick and the moon is a sliver, locals say you can hear sounds that aren't the wind. You can hear the snick-snick of a knife whittling wood. You can hear the heavy tread of boots patrolling the ridgeline. And if you are foolish enough to carry a shovel, if you are greedy enough to look for the green gold, you might feel a cold hand on your shoulder and a whisper in your ear. Watch the seeds. The story of Elias Thorne is not a parable of good and evil. It is a tragedy of ownership. It asks us who really owns the land, the man who holds the deed or the man who bleeds into the soil. It forces us to confront the violence we are capable of when our survival is threatened, and the terrifying logic of a man who loved nature so much he was willing to kill for it. Elias Thorne was a monster to the law, a savior to the forest, and a mystery to history. He watered his garden with blood, and in the end, the garden bloomed. Was it worth it? 9 lives for a patch of roots? Only the forest knows the answer, and the forest doesn't speak to strangers. If this story of the Appalachian Purge and the curse of the green gold chilled you to the bone, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. We unearth the buried secrets of history the crimes that happened in the shadows where the law couldn't reach. Share this video if you believe that some places should remain wild. And tell us in the comments, if you found a fortune in the woods, would you take it, or would you leave it buried? Until next time, stay out of the deep woods, respect the boundaries, and remember, nature is not a resource, it's a judge, and its verdict is final.